The sea was an unforgiving lover. She called out to sailors with visions of liberty, riches, and honor, only to lock them inside a boundless prison of blue, where their most fundamental human cravings started to decay. For those who lived as pirates, the most terrifying aspect of ocean life wasn't the threat of cannon fire or execution by rope. It was the stillness that followed violent tempests, the profound and suffocating hush of a vessel filled with sailors who had no outlet for their deepest yearnings. The name of this tale, How Did Pirates Survive Without Sex?, goes beyond simple curiosity. It opens a door into the most peculiar suffering experienced by history's most rebellious criminals. Picture this scene. 80 sailors packed into a wooden tomb made of timber and pitch, the atmosphere heavy with perspiration, brine, and unwashed flesh. The planks groan with every surge. Rodents dart across leather boots. The provisions reek of decay. The spirits are diluted to maintain control, and days stretch into months without glimpsing a female face, without physical contact, without any hint of tenderness. They ruled the waters, yet remained prisoners to their own nature. In the lower quarters, sleeping nets hung beside one another, the material moist from the ocean's moisture. A sailor might extend his arm through the darkness and accidentally touch another's arm, a stark reminder that the sole form of human nearness within reach was the identical gender squeezed beside you in quarters scarcely wide enough to draw breath. A few made light of it. Others turned to prayer. The majority simply gazed at the wooden beams overhead, allowing the rhythm of the surf to silence what their flesh demanded. Pirates embodied paradox. They challenged monarchs and the divine, yet remained unable to overcome their physical nature. Longing transformed into a sort of insanity upon the open ocean, a burning they bore as certainly as they bore their blades. They performed crude ballads, not for amusement, but to discharge pressure that possessed no other escape route. Carvings of unclothed females etched into timber with worn blades became monuments to recollection. A bosom, a silhouette, a title barely recalled from a pleasure house in Havana. This became the worship practiced upon a buccaneer's vessel. Each journey transformed into a gradual combustion of suppression, and suppression, as history demonstrates, inevitably discovers a fissure through which to emerge. Around the third moon at sea, even the most controlled company grew agitated. Brawls erupted over insignificant matters, a vanished portion, an unlucky game of chance, a slight whispered beneath one's breath. Yet underneath everything lay the identical strain, the unacknowledged exasperation of sailors confined together for excessive duration. They spoke in jest about females in every harbor, though those jests were phantoms. A buccaneer's journal, salvaged ages later from a shipwreck beyond the Barbados shore, captured it plainly. We consume salt. We inhale salt. We envision salt. Even our life fluid seems parched, no female sound to moisten the soul.
That aridity wasn't merely figurative, it represented mental anguish. Upon a vessel where order ensured survival, the commanders understood this quiet danger could become deadly. So what was their approach? The primary principle governing a buccaneer's carnal urges was rejection. Formerly, the ocean belonged to males, a fraternity constructed upon power, devotion, and the dismissal of gentle enticements. Females were deemed cursed luck aboard. Their attendance was believed to provoke the ocean's wrath. Yet that belief concealed deeper reality. It proved simpler to prohibit females that acknowledge what could occur in their non-attendance. Still, history refuses to yield to rejection. From that seclusion emerged something unforeseen, partnerships born of necessity. Buccaneers termed it Matalottage, from the French expression matelot, signifying seaman. Two sailors would establish a connection, sometimes legitimate under their regulations, vowing to divide treasure, supplies, and frequently sleeping quarters. It wasn't invariably intimate, Occasionally it existed purely for endurance. Yet upon the shifting platform, where solitude could shatter a sailor's mind, boundaries dissolved rapidly. These unions received quiet acknowledgement. They battled side by side, rested side by side, and upon one's demise, the survivor claimed his possessions, a somber reflection of matrimony. Scholars continue debating its prevalence, though sufficient documentation survived to confirm it wasn't uncommon. Envision this: two weathered sea raiders beneath lunar glow exchanging a container of spirits, conversing in lowered tones about existence before the ocean. A parent, a beloved, a dwelling forfeited to destitution or conflict. Then quietness, the noise of swells striking the ship's side. Within that hush, fellowship evolved beyond solace. It evolved into requirement. Yet for each account of peaceful fellowship, darker tales existed. Not every sailor managed deprivation with honor. There existed murmurs, instances of compulsion, mistreatment of younger mariners. Even brutality spawned from passion and exasperation. The ocean passed no judgment, though it retained memory. Commanders delivered savage penalties for deviant behaviors. Still, they also recognized their frequency. The penalty wasn't righteous indignation, or rather it was terror. Terror that disgrace might fracture a company more swiftly than rebellion. Therefore, most looked away deliberately. Don't inquire, don't speak wasn't created by contemporary armed forces. It originated upon those platforms ages prior. And then arrived the harbors. When the extended journeys ultimately concluded and the dock illumination emerged upon the skyline, self-control exploded like fragile crystal. Complete companies erupted into disorder, consuming alcohol, wagering, and pursuing satisfaction like sailors who'd experienced starvation. Within the drinking establishments of Nassau and Port Royal, the pleasure houses overflowed beyond capacity. Ladies of the night accumulated wealth in a solitary evening, while clergy begged for the settlement's redemption. One recorder documented,
"The settlement blazed not from flame, but from carnal desire. Yet liberation arrived with consequences. Illness was the quiet buccaneer sovereign. Syphilis, gonorrhea, smallpox, maladies that consumed flesh and reason. Certain buccaneers exhausted their spoils on a single evening of ecstasy, only to perish in agony days afterward. The paradox proved harsh. They'd endured tempests and military conflicts only to fall victim to an embrace. Still, the craving resurged constantly. When expeditions extended excessively and the skyline stayed barren, despair assumed unusual shapes. Farm animals represented occasionally the sole alternative living beings aboard. Goats, swine, fowl, nourishment certainly, though also enticement. Judicial documentation from British maritime collections referenced instances of carnal acts with creatures, transgressions deserving capital punishment. A commander's record from 1698 stated bluntly, "Jerry the cook was discovered in transgression with the goat. He received lashing nearly to expiration. The creature was consumed." Dark wit, though factual, the human consciousness can justify anything when confined in tedium and ocean atmosphere. Not every expedition proved that dismal, though. Occasionally, within the most unusual reaches of the ocean, buccaneers discovered methods to find humor in their own misery. They performed vulgar theatrical productions, performed melodies saturated with suggestive content, or sculpted obscene shapes into storage containers. It was condemned man's humor, the variety that preserves sailors' reason. When reason becomes a privilege, and throughout everything, alcohol poured like vital fluid. Spirits transformed into both remedy and flight. It numbed the pain of abstinence, converted rage into amusement, and softened the harsh boundaries of desire. An intoxicated company proved simpler to control than a frantic one, though spirits carried their cost, too. Inebriated disputes could become fatal. A reckless push during disagreement, a dagger retrieved too hastily, and by dawn one fewer sailor in the sleeping net. The ocean retrieved him silently, as it did countless others. There existed, nevertheless, another mystery.
one concealed behind murmurs and costumes. Occasionally, a female would bypass the restrictions and board a vessel camouflaged as a male, wrapped in cloth or baggy garments. She'd enlist with the company. Anne, Bonnie, Mary Read, their titles became mythology, though their reasons weren't sentimental. They represented survival. Solid ground provided fewer opportunities than the ocean. Liberty, even amongst murderers, remained liberty. When their actual identities were revealed, responses differed. Certain companies honored them as peers. Others grew antagonistic, perceiving them as dangers to structure. Still, within that harsh, unregulated realm, certain sailors discovered in these females not controversy, but something perilously resembling affection. And that represented the unspoken reality of buccaneer existence. Under the markings, the savagery, the infinite skyline, they remained sailors yearning for attachment. They constructed a legend of dread and passion to conceal it, yet their melodies betrayed them. Amongst stanzas about riches and warfare, there existed invariably phrases about a maiden abandoned, an embrace recalled, a vow never honored. During their infrequent instances of isolation, observing the lunar light shimmer upon dark waters, sensing the vessel creak beneath their souls, even the most savage buccaneer could feel insignificant. The realm proved immense, the ocean everlasting, and their satisfactions temporary. Longing wasn't merely a diversion. It represented the singular element that recalled to them they remained human. That's the authentic mystery concealed under ages of idealistic legends.
The Buccaneers' battle wasn't solely against kingdoms or traders. It was against their personal seclusion, against the craving that couldn't be satisfied with spirits or spoils, against the solitude that no quantity of merriment could submerge. They could plunder monarchs and destroy vessels, though they could never flee themselves. And that's where the narrative genuinely commences, because what buccaneers accomplished subsequently to gratify that craving would obscure every boundary between endurance, transgression, and human necessity. The further you venture into the buccaneer realm, the more you comprehend that their supreme adversary wasn't the naval forces or the execution platform. It was the void that pursued them constantly. Upon the ocean, seclusion bore down like the burden of the heavens themselves. Eventually, every sailor aboard discovered his personal method to occupy the quietness. Certain sailors turned to prayer, others to drink, and some simply adapted. After the initial cannon blast and once the final harbor disappeared beyond the skyline, yearning became simultaneously forbidden and essential. Buccaneers followed an unusual ethical system shaped not by holy texts or civilization, but by the need to survive. You avoided posing questions that might fracture the vessel apart. The ocean possessed its own regulations, and the primary one was straightforward. What occurs upon the waves remains upon the waves. The chronicler Charles Johnson once documented that buccaneers formed partnerships according to their preferences, connected to them through vows and fondness. He was employing courtesy. Those partnerships represented the concealed foundation of buccaneer existence, sailors who divided everything from riches to suffering. The system Matalottage proved as functional as it was personal. Companions split plunder, battled alongside one another, and tended to each other when sickness or wounds arrived. No legal tribunal acknowledged these bonds. No clergyman sanctified them. Still, within the drifting lawlessness of a vessel, they frequently represented the sole form of faithfulness that genuinely endured. Upon one companion's death, the survivor claimed his portion. A buccaneer's interpretation of final wishes, sealed not through writing, but through bloodshed and mutual evenings. Yet this arrangement possessed darkness. For each partnership created from fondness, others concealed compulsion or practicality.
The identical confined spaces that cultivated fellowship could simultaneously generate abuse. Commanders maintained order through intimidation, and that intimidation reached beneath the platform. Younger mariners, ammunition boys, quarters assistants remained defenseless to the desires of more powerful sailors. There exist dispersed reports in maritime records of violations murmured amongst companies, penalized when uncovered, disregarded when practical. The formal accusation was sodomy, deserving execution by rope. The informal penalty proved frequently quietness. Still, within that distorted environment, not every closeness carried shame. Certain individuals discovered genuine fondness amid the disorder. When you devote years observing identical countenances through starvation, tempest, and carnage, connections develop that resist classification. Correspondence salvaged from seized vessels revealed gentleness amid savagery. Plain phrases like, "Tell him I maintained his blade near my chest," or "He performed melodies until the pole collapsed."
These aren't the expressions of devils. They're the expressions of sailors famished for attachment. And then the harbors. When the anchor descended and the boarding ramp struck the wharf, the buccaneers underwent transformation. Following months of constraint, complete companies exploded like ammunition containers. Nassau, Tortuga, Port Royal, these settlements represented the release mechanisms of the Caribbean realm. The drinking establishments brimmed with melody and odor. Candles flickered dimly, spirits flowed like crimson, and the atmosphere reeked of perspiration and fragrance. Pleasure houses transformed into sanctuaries of disorder. Females and occasionally males queued to exchange the fantasy of gentleness. Buccaneers exhausted their wealth in a solitary evening, exchanging gold for 60 minutes of forgetting. The surfaces of those chambers were adhesive with spirits and remorse. Community documentation captures the frenzy vividly. In a single Port Royal record from 1718, a drinking establishment proprietor documented, "The buccaneers arrived like a tempest. They consumed until words abandoned them, and they claimed until they couldn't remain upright. By dawn, the pathways reeked of illness, crimson, and merriment. Yet there existed a more sinister price. Illness lurked constantly. Syphilis, gonorrhea, smallpox, maladies that devoured flesh and reason together. Without remedies, a solitary error could terminate existence. Certain sailors covered their bodies with mercury salves that seared through the flesh. Others consumed mixtures of cinders and sour wine, hoping it might purify the bodily fluids. It failed. Numerous buccaneers perished not from firearm discharge, but from what they acquired in the sleeping quarters of an unknown person. It represented a savage paradox. They dreaded the executioner's cord, yet the authentic stranglehold remained invisible, wrapped inside their circulation. And still, none of this halted them. In reality, buccaneer financial systems relied on passion. Pleasure house proprietors, spirit merchants, and dishonest authorities accumulated riches from each fresh company that docked, half-maddened from abstinence. Leaders accepted payments to ignore activities. Certain harbors even established informal timetables, vessels arriving after nightfall, females transported covertly from interior settlements, the exchanges masked as welcoming. For numerous buccaneers, this evolved into ceremony. Months of control followed by 7 days of forgetfulness, then returning to ocean, returning to craving, returning to acting. Yet certain individuals, particularly those who voyaged for years, started to create fresh ceremonies. Spirits transformed into treatment. Spirits represented everything. It numbed the suffering, obscured limits, and eased dispositions. A buccaneer exchanged between palms exceeded a beverage. It represented holy rite. Sailors performed more loudly, quarreled less, and for several hours forgot the duration since they'd experienced compassionate contact. Spirits also transformed into a cover. Under its fog, prohibitions vanished. Two sailors dividing a covering could subsequently dismiss it as intoxication. No inquiries, no condemnation. That represented the understanding. If the vessel operated and the artillery discharged upon instruction,
Nobody concerned themselves with what transpired after the lamps faded. Yet, occasionally, the solitude proved too acute for merriment to soften. That's where the accounts of gender disguises and concealed females emerge from mythology and into recorded history. Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read represented the most renowned, though not the sole ones. Females who camouflaged themselves as males infiltrated buccaneer companies for motivations as diverse as endurance, vengeance, or absolute rebellion. Once aboard, they demonstrated equal ruthlessness and competence as any sailor. And within the suffocating reality of vessel existence, certain individuals inevitably established connections. There exists suggestions, brief, captivating, of these attractions in correspondence and judicial documentation, a crewmate's questionable devotion, a commander's unwillingness to discipline, a revealed female, a murmured tale of affection behind secured entrances. When Mary Read was ultimately exposed, observers declared she had been enormously cherished by her fellow sailors.
The expression was intentional. It communicated everything without communicating anything. Yet for each uncommon affection account, there existed countless catastrophes. When longing violated the incorrect boundary, discipline arrived rapidly. In 1720, a mariner named Thomas Granger was executed in Jamaica for deviant transgression with a creature. His demise was intended to frighten others into self-control. Still, ages afterward, the identical report emerged again. Goats, swine, even tropical birds cataloged among casualties. Mariners were human creatures, reduced to their most fundamental urges, and occasionally those urges became horrific. The ocean offered no mercy, yet it comprehended. Still, the most severe anguish wasn't bodily craving. It was the isolation that expanded between each surge. You can detect it in the melodies they abandoned. Under the swagger and vulgarity, buccaneer work songs overflow with yearning. They perform about maidens who never remained faithful, of sleeping places grown frigid, of harbors that dissolve in the fog. The tunes sound cheerful, yet the lyrics hurt like injuries. It's simple to ridicule the tales, the intoxicated mariners, the livestock jests, the carnal wit. Yet underneath, everything rests a reality as ancient as humankind. Remove affection, and even the most savage sailors collapse. Contemporary audiences adore idealizing buccaneers, the confidence, the excitement, the riches. Yet the actuality was profound seclusion. Each expedition challenged not merely bravery, but mental stability. They existed in a realm where contact itself transformed into forbidden material, where closeness might signify death, and where each sailor's flesh represented both armament and confinement. Certain academics contend that this denial molded buccaneer civilization itself, that their recklessness on solid ground, their appetite for disorder, even their brutal fraternities, all originated from the identical source, the frantic requirement to sense vitality. When they arrived at a harbor, they didn't merely pursue females, they pursued evidence that they remained in existence. Each intoxicated expression of joy, each impulsive confrontation, each gold piece thrown into the darkness represented defiance against the quietness they transported from ocean to coastline. But no defiance persists eternally. By the conclusion of their abbreviated existences, most buccaneers didn't witness 40 years. They frequently perished the manner they existed, encircled by sailors, isolated in every alternative sense. No spouse, no kin, no reliable grasp to clutch as the current dragged them below. Their titles dissolved into the ocean spray. And still, even in their deterioration, there's a disturbing authenticity. Buccaneers reduced existence to its savage essence. They existed without regulations, yet they couldn't flee the regulations inscribed in crimson and marrow. Craving, isolation, longing, these are the forces that draw every human creature, regardless of fierceness, returning to the identical reality. Under the legends of concealed riches and thundering artillery rests a more subdued account, one of requirement, disgrace, and endurance. The identical sailors who incinerated settlements and challenged monarchs shuddered after dark with the identical hollowness we all recognize. That's the contradiction that renders their account memorable. The buccaneers of mythology dominated oceans, yet they could never dominate themselves. Their vessels have since submerged, their remains dispersed across reef and sediment. Yet the reverberations persist in each intoxicated melody, each scratched engraving, each murmured legend of two mariners dividing warmth against the chill. And if you attend carefully, you can still detect them. phantoms of sailors who exchanged everything for liberty, only to realize that the supreme confinement existed internally. The ocean proved immense, yet never enough to submerge desire. That represented their damnation. That is their inheritance.